most important element is really the notion around, well, our own Indigenous sovereignty, our mana takitaki. You know, the fact is with Alternative and indeed with the work with Ngāpai, these are Indigenous centres directed by Indigenous peoples. And so we are able to align our values very strongly, also with those around publication more broadly. So for me, one of the most important elements is power and is direction. It's the recognition of the significance and the importance of Indigenous work, the significance and importance of the dissemination of that work. We recognise we have particular responsibilities for that work to be robust, to be very considered. We want it to support the flourishing of our own people and indeed for the international Indigenous communities. So I think that's one of the really strong elements, so that you can't have cultural safety without having autonomy and power within that space. So I think that with Alternative, we were able to, from its very inception, though it was centred here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it was always going to be our international flagship. In terms of the review process, one of the decisions that we made, well, really from its onset, was to ensure that if we had a piece of work that was Sami, for example, coming from Sami, if we had another piece that was coming from Choctaw, if we had it coming from Ngāti Porou, one of our tribal areas here, that at least we would seek to have at least one of our reviewers being from that community. In some cases, we've gone back to ensure that the knowledge holders in that area have given permission for the work to be done. So we look for, in terms of our review process, we look to ensure that it has the disciplinary background, if it comes from a psychology background, anthropological background, sociological background, education background. We largely look for Indigenous peoples within that area. But if we don't, we will look for reviewers, but we will always have Indigenous reviewers. And in many cases, all of our reviewers will be Indigenous. And I do recognise we have a huge database in regards to our reviewers, and it's a very large international database that's been built up over time. And so that's a very important element as well.
I think the other aspect of it is to ensure that there's a focus on keeping in the Indigenous lens, the Indigenous world centred in the review. So thinking about the kinds of people who are being asked to review, and looking not only for connection to community, looking for disciplinary expertise, but also thinking about whether these reviewers are ones which are going to keep the Indigenous world front and centre in their thinking and in their review.
I think just really continue to write about our Indigenous worldview that is not crossing over into like sharing of sacred information or teachings or anything like that, but just and being specific, not moving away from that. Like whenever I've taught Indigenous research, graduate Indigenous research class for the School of Public Health, I've always told students, like, especially Indigenous students, write from where your nation is. Don't take this pan-Indigenous approach. So if you're going to submit to a paper, write from where your nation is, like write from where you're from, your people, your community. You know that worldview the best. So write from your worldview, define your worldview so that there is more of that understanding of how diverse we are and how diverse of where we come from, so that there is a better understanding out there. And even for like up and coming people that are from your own nation, can go to your writing and your paper and say, so-and-so wrote this about my nation, and here's proof that this is, because that's, anytime you write for a journal or academic paper, you have to show the proof. whether that's oral history or, you still have to prove where that came from. So you have the proof. The more of us that write from that perspective and that understanding, I think that's so incredibly valuable for up and coming students to write about that, or really anybody that's interested in publishing or doing research and wants to publish it, is where are you coming from? That's our self-location. Talk about where we are, who we are, where we come from, that's important.
I think that over time we developed far more in terms of the ethics around Indigenous research, and that is, ensuring we recognise that while work may come at an individual level, it nearly always talks about collective experience, and so there's a real, thinking about what the ethics of that work is. As I said, we're much more in the space of looking at supporting work that's done by and for Indigenous communities. And so that's an important element. We often talk about work that comes in that sort of speaks, as I said, that will talk about Indigenous people, or will put them in some ahistorical past, or will not fully contextualize that work. That work may find other avenues for dissemination. It won't find it with us. Also, we do take on the normal ethical standards expected around publication, but we add significant layers to that.
I think it has. There are now more Indigenous focused publications, and that generally means that the kinds of issues around thinking about who are the reviewers and about connection to community are more likely to form part of that review process with those kinds of journals. But I think there's still a long way to go, and for many publications this really doesn't feature as part of their thinking, and part of what we see with the Academy as a whole, but when you look at the kinds of people who are editors of publications, editors of journals, who are identified as the people who have expertise for reviewing, those have, for all kinds of historical reasons, tended to exclude Indigenous peoples. And so that means that there's a lot of work to do in terms of changing that, and it needs to be done quite deliberately. As I say, I think we have, with more Indigenous publications, Indigenous focused publications, that there has been a change in starting to see the importance of different kinds of reviewers, having different kinds of people involved in the editorial process.
Like, we're changing things up, which is really exciting. And I think that's been a huge, I would say, just even within the last 5 years, that's been a huge shift. And really being more specific in how that's done. I know, for me, my own work, it's I've taken a real interest in looking at research around being on the land, or land-based research. I know that's been really big in education, but hasn't been really big in HIV. So having those different broad, different areas being able to write about that, but also having, people understand what that is now. I don't think that was common 10 years ago or 8 years ago. I've been doing this since 2007. So, it's been I've seen a huge shift, and it's really exciting because you couldn't write about that stuff before. People would be they just didn't have the understanding. And now they have that understanding of what Indigenous knowledge is. And they know that it's complex and it's not just something that's easily defined. So I've been involved with the Cedar Project since 2013. So quite a long time. and have a lot of publications with them, so as a co-author, and so have been able to see the responses or the revisions that they required. And I would say initially, it was a fight to just use the term Indigenous. It was a fight to and I mean by fight is we had to push back. And now there's a better understanding of it. Except we've just had a recent incident where we wanted to publish a paper addressing racism, and we as the partnership, so as the governing body for the Cedar Project, had to push back. And it was they didn't even read the manuscript. We got a response within a couple hours. It was just unreal. So we pushed back, and we thought it was unfair because given the context and where we are right now with the racism in healthcare, I think sometimes we as Indigenous people don't want to push back. That's not really our way. In our view, it would be disrespectful to push back or to talk back. You just don't do that. That's our teaching. That's how, we've been taught. But if we think about context, so if we think about pushing back in a Western view, a Western perspective, or a Western way, not to our own people, I think we have to be really mindful of how our own teachings are and how we were brought up. For me, I wasn't brought up, you don't talk back to your elders. You just, anybody older than you, they could be a month older you don't talk back. I mean, that's really difficult now when we're really encouraged to speak up and speak your truth, But I think for when we get a paper that's rejected that we feel is really strong and has a lot to contribute, that we push back. We write that letter to the editors and state our case. So we're educating that journal to think about how why they're rejecting a paper, to really look at why they're rejecting this paper. And if it doesn't align with because the feedback we got was well, it still doesn't align with our journal. And we're okay, well, we don't necessarily agree with that. Thankfully, we have somebody who can navigate that Western world a lot better and responded with, thank you for your response. We're going to go to somebody else. And thankfully, there's a lot of other journals that we can go to. But to push back, to write those letters back to the journals to say, whether it's you're individually writing a paper, which isn't really common in my world, it's always written by a group of authors, but to push back and say, and then to support that person and say let's do it. Let's write that letter back to them and say, nope, we don't agree with this, and this is why, and here's our argument. And and if you still get the rejection, you can always respond with, thank you for your response. We're going to go to someone else. Which is it's really just to try and get that journal to think about, to really closely review why they rejected it, and then also perhaps have a conversation. I mean, it'd be great if they did delve a little bit deeper into why they were rejecting something that clearly aligned with their journal.
I think the barriers of trying to, particularly in writing in mainstream journals, is some of those are methodological barriers where reviewers do not have the requisite expertise to actually review Indigenous pieces of work. And a lot of that we see around methodological issues. So I think there's still the barriers around what constitutes research. I think for us, we have a much more broader view, and ours is really very much around impact and outcomes. But also, as I said, contributing to that Indigenous canon of knowledge. And so I think over time we have far greater levels of precedent in the works that you've done. For a lot of, for us down in Aotearoa, New Zealand, many of those questions have been asked and answered, but we recognise in other parts of the world there are still really significant barriers in terms of recognising who knowledge holders are, the use of discourse narrative, the drawing on traditional knowledges to address contemporary issues. As I said, for many, the peer review process is not robust enough because the reviewers themselves may have disciplinary knowledge, but actually they just do not have the requisite expertise. And so, that's why the database of, we have truly thousands on our reviewer database, and many of them extremely well-known reviewers who are non-Indigenous, researchers and that. And I see that as an educative moment. For some questions will be asked by those reviewers, I'm not sure on this. It does provide a space for that educative place. I always say the academic life is a life of rejection, and that's one of the sorts of things. And we have done workshops just around that peer review process about how you can respond in a constructive way, how you can sort of think again, what are the outcomes I'm seeking for the people that I serve, and does this review improve that? If you see elements in your review that really do come from a reviewer's ignorance or them not having the requisite skills to understand Indigenous ways of being, knowing and doing, then I think that response must go back to the journal that you've submitted to. I think that needs to be done respectfully, but journals themselves have a responsibility to ensure that they're able to select reviewers who have the requisite skills and knowledge to be able to review. So it's sort of a hardening up process, but it's also this educative process. It's one of the fatiguing things within Indigenous scholarship, is that you're not only disseminating, but you're nearly always having to educate non-Indigenous people.
When Indigenous scholars have made submissions and are getting comments and feedbacks back on their work, which is coming from people who are don't necessarily have the right skills, in the sense that they don't appreciate Indigenous knowledge or don't see the same value of Indigenous knowledge, that can be really harmful for our Indigenous scholars, in the sense that it's often difficult enough getting a review back and seeing that there are a whole lot of revisions that need to be made, or having your submission rejected. That can be, a difficult thing to work through. But it's even worse, I think, when you look at the comments that are made or the reasons why this is rejected, and you can see that actually there's no appreciation for an Indigenous perspective from the reviewer, or even there's often some quite overtly racist kinds of feedback that are made in comments as well. So it's really important to try and ensure also that the feedback that Indigenous scholars are receiving are recognising the perspectives, the skills, the expertise and the knowledge that they bring. But I think it's also useful to think about what that whole review process looks like, and whether that's the kind of process that many Indigenous people would assume was one which produced good quality outcomes at the end as well. And I think that's one of the things to think about is, we have this anonymous peer review process for journals, and there's an assumption that from kind of Western academy tradition that this leads to kind of high quality publications. And I think it's really important that we are careful about assuming that there might in fact be other ways which actually build more on relationships rather than detachment and anonymity. And it's possible that we can think about the whole process is needing to be changed, not just the people who are participating in it or the perspectives that are brought to bear, but whether the kind of ways in which we review for academic publications is the best way of doing it, or the only way of doing it. Perhaps there are lots of different ways in which we could conceptualize this process to lead to high quality outcomes.
One of the things that we often think is a really interesting one is around co-authorship. For many of our Indigenous students, for example, that they do their first lots of review with supervisors or with trusted, respected allies and scholars. The review process for many can be really hard, and in some cases when you're dealing with knowledge that is deep knowledge from within communities, in some cases knowledge that feels like sacred knowledge or is sacred knowledge, then actually going through a review process and have people questioning those elements or demanding responses can cause real pain and harm, and in some ways it feel like part of that colonizing process again. So I think working with particularly for junior and Indigenous students, working with supervisors and others to take in that first process, to be able to sit with that process and work the way through. In many cases, when you look at what, the suggestions or considerations that are made by reviewers, you just need to reflect on them. Do they, will they improve this paper? Will they create greater levels of clarity? So you can look at those, you still retain your autonomy about what you will accept and what you won't do. So I think that that's a really important part of it.
I want to pave the way for the next generation, and I'm happy to mentor and happy to help, but we need interest from younger people. And by younger, I mean like maybe up and coming, not necessarily in age, but to do it so that when we are in these positions, that we have that understanding already of what our people, what is sensitive to our people, what our communities understand, what our people understand, what is okay, what is not okay. Like, I've been on this study or doing this scoping review on Indigenous knowledges. I've been reading a lot of these documents, and some of it that I've come across, it's like, those are like sacred things that you shouldn't be putting in a paper. So having that knowledge and having that understanding, and we're all learning. It's everybody will have a different perspective, but I think, the more you do it, the more you learn, the more you kind of get a better grasp of what's okay, what's not okay, what you should be looking for. And there are like so many people willing to share and support and, to do this when you have questions. Or I think for us is like, who are even been doing this for a while, but like as we're learning to kind of ask those questions and not be afraid to do it, like that whole environment makes it culturally safe, because it's like I can go to Charlotte or others, in her position and say, I don't know how to respond to this, or I'm reading this and I'm not sure that it's right, and can you help me figure it out, and get that mentorship from them. All of that process makes it culturally safe, I think. You don't feel like you're not alone. Whereas, I don't know, it seems like academia, you're sort of siloed, right? You're not encouraged to go to your mentors or your peers or the others to ask questions. Whereas we've always been encouraged to do that as Indigenous people.